Hey, beautiful souls, welcome back to Soul Stories. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to join our family. Stay with us, because a new love story is about to begin. He rejected dozens of brides who came with dreams of his fortune. Then a woman arrived who had already buried hers along with everyone she ever loved. Caleb Thornton had built his empire from dirt and desperation. At 42 years old, he owned 17,000 acres of Montana ranchland, 3,000 head of cattle, and a house so grand that people traveled from neighboring counties just to glimpse its stone facade rising against the mountains. His father had died a drunk and penniless, leaving behind nothing but debt and shame, and Caleb had spent 20 years proving that the Thornton name could mean something different. He had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, transforming himself from a boy who wore shoes with holes into a man who could buy anything he desired. Yet the one thing everyone insisted he needed remained conspicuously absent from his life: a wife. The Matchmakers came first, riding up his long gravel road with painted smiles and daughters dressed in their Sunday finest. Mrs. Patterson brought her eldest, a pleasant woman with good teeth, who spoke endlessly about wanting children. Caleb listened politely for an hour, served them coffee from fine china cups, and sent them home with preserved peaches from his orchard. The Hendricks widow arrived next with her granddaughter, a beauty with golden hair, who touched his arm too often and laughed too loudly at things that were not funny. He recognized the hunger in her eyes, the way she looked at his possessions rather than his face, cataloging the worth of his furniture, his silver, his land. She too went home with nothing but polite rejection. Over the years they kept coming. Young women, widows, spinsters growing desperate, daughters of ranchers looking to merge empires. Some were kind, some were beautiful, some were intelligent and would have made fine partners for any other man. But Caleb saw through each of them to the common thread that bound them all together. They wanted what he had built. They wanted security, wealth, status, a comfortable life purchased with his sweat and sacrifice. Not one of them wanted him, the man who still dreamed of his mother's grave and woke some nights unable to breathe from the weight of memories he could never escape. His ranch hands whispered that he was too particular. The townspeople speculated that he preferred solitude. His lawyer suggested he was protecting his assets, and perhaps he should consider a detailed prenuptial agreement. None of them understood the truth that Caleb kept buried beneath his stoic exterior. He had loved once, deeply and completely, when he was 23 and still struggling to keep his first 100 acres from the bank. Her name was Mary Ellen, a school teacher with ink-stained fingers and a laugh that sounded like water over stones. She had loved him when he had nothing, had believed in him when even he doubted himself, and had died of fever 3 weeks before they were to be married. Something in Caleb had closed that winter, frozen solid like the ground where they buried her, and in 19 years it had never thawed. The October morning when everything changed began like any other. Caleb rode out before dawn to check the fence line along the eastern boundary, where wolves had been spotted the previous week. The air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, and frost silvered the grass beneath his horse's hooves. He was thinking about the cattle drive scheduled for the following month when he noticed something unusual near the old Miller Creek crossing. A figure sat motionless on the bank, small and dark against the pale morning light, and for a moment he thought it might be a child who had wandered from one of the neighboring farms. As he drew closer, he realized it was a woman. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest, her dress torn and muddied, her dark hair hanging loose and tangled around a face so pale it seemed almost translucent. She did not look up at his approach, did not react to the sound of hoofbeats or the snort of his horse. She simply stared at the water moving past with eyes that seemed to see nothing at all. Caleb dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He had handled frightened animals enough times to recognize shock when he saw it, and this woman wore it like a second skin. Her boots were worn through at the soles. Her hands, resting on her knees, were raw and blistered. She looked as though she had been walking for days, perhaps weeks, and had finally stopped not because she had arrived somewhere, but because her body had simply refused to carry her any further. He spoke gently, introducing himself, asking if she needed help. For a long moment, she did not respond. Then her eyes shifted slowly to meet his, and he saw something in their depths that knocked the breath from his lungs. They were gray, those eyes, pale as winter sky, and they held a devastation so complete that Caleb felt his own buried grief stir in recognition. This was a woman who had lost everything, not possessions or status or comfort, but something far more essential. The light that makes life worth living had gone out of her, and what remained was only the shell, still breathing out of habit rather than desire. Her name, she told him eventually in a voice rough from disuse, was Clara. She offered no surname, no history, no explanation for her presence on his land. When he asked where she was traveling, she shook her head slowly. Nowhere. She was traveling nowhere. She'd been walking because walking was what her feet did, but she had no destination, no purpose, no one waiting for her anywhere in the world. The words came out flat and factual, without self-pity or plea for sympathy. She was simply stating the truth of her existence as one might comment on the weather. Caleb knew he should bring her to town, to the church that helped travelers in distress, or to the doctor who could examine her for illness or injury. That was the sensible thing, the proper thing, the thing any reasonable man would do. Instead, he found himself helping her onto his horse and riding home with her balanced before him, her slight weight leaning against his chest, her body trembling with exhaustion. His housekeeper, Ruth, was a practical woman who had served his family for 30 years and had learned not to question his decisions. She took one look at Clara, set her mouth in a firm line, and began heating water for a bath. Within hours, the stranger was installed in the guest room on the second floor, dressed in clean clothes borrowed from Ruth's own wardrobe, sleeping a sleep so deep it resembled death. She slept for 2 days. When she finally woke, Ruth brought her soup and bread and received only quiet thanks in return. Clara ate slowly, mechanically, with the careful movements of someone relearning basic functions. She asked for nothing. This struck Caleb more powerfully than anything else about her. In all his years of dealing with people who wanted his money, his land, his influence, his favor, he had never encountered anyone who asked for absolutely nothing. She did not inquire about his wealth or his circumstances. She did not wonder aloud how long she might stay. She did not suggest that she could be useful around the house or attempt to make herself indispensable. She simply existed, quiet and contained, expecting nothing and offering nothing in return. Over the following weeks, Caleb found himself inventing reasons to pass by her room or linger in the parlor, where she sometimes sat looking out the window. She never initiated conversation, but she answered his questions when he asked them, and gradually, in fragments and glimpses, her story emerged. She had been married to a man named Thomas, who had been decent and kind, a farmer in Kansas who had worked himself to exhaustion, trying to make the land yield enough to survive. They had built a life together, small but full of love, and they had created 3 children who filled their tiny house with laughter and chaos and purpose. Then the sickness came, the fever that swept through the prairie towns that summer, like the hand of an angry god. Thomas went first, then the children one by one, the youngest lasting only hours after her brother. Clara had nursed them all, had held each of them as they slip, ed away, had dug graves with her own blistered hands, because there was no one left to help her. Then she had started walking, and she had not stopped until her body collapsed on his creek bank. Caleb listened to her story without interruption, without offering empty words of comfort or the usual platitudes people speak when confronted with tragedy they cannot comprehend. He understood that some grief was too vast for words, too deep for consolation. When she finished speaking, He simply sat with her in silence, and something in her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The first crack in the wall of numbness she had built around herself. She began helping around the ranch, not because anyone asked her to, but because stillness had become unbearable. She collected eggs from the henhouse, her movements slow but steady. She mended clothes with stitches so small and precise they were nearly invisible. She worked in the kitchen with Ruth, learning the recipes that had been passed down through 3 generations of the housekeeper's family. She never spoke of payment or arrangements or how long she might stay. She never spoke of the future at all, as though the concept had become meaningless to her. Caleb watched her heal in increments so small they were almost invisible. The color returned to her cheeks, her hands steadied. She began to eat without being reminded. One morning in late November, he heard a sound from the kitchen that stopped him in his tracks. It was laughter. Brief and rusty, startled out of her by something Ruth had said. Clara looked almost frightened by the sound, as though her own capacity for joy had betrayed her, but Caleb felt something shift in his chest, something that had been locked away for 19 years. He began to know her in the small moments that accumulate into intimacy, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she concentrated, the rhythm of her footsteps on the stairs, her habit of humming while she worked, melodies he did not recognize, perhaps songs her children had known. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense that the Matchmakers valued, but there was something in her face that drew his gaze again and again, a quality of depth and survival that made other women seem shallow by comparison. Winter came hard that year, blizzards that trapped them indoors for days at a time. They sat by the fire in the evenings, Caleb reading and Clara sewing, the silence between them comfortable rather than awkward. He told her about Mary Ellen one night, the first time he had spoken her name aloud in nearly 2 decades. Clara listened without judgment, without the jealousy he might have expected, and when he finished, she reached across the space between their chairs and touched his hand briefly. The contact lasted only a moment, but it burned through him like whiskey. By spring, the townspeople had begun to gossip. The wealthy Thornton had taken in a stranger, a woman of unknown background and questionable history, and she showed no signs of leaving. The Matchmakers stopped coming, interpreting her presence as a claim already staked. His lawyer visited with concerns about property and propriety and protection of assets. Caleb listened politely and ignored every word. He knew what people assumed, what they whispered, what they believed was happening under his roof. They were wrong, but not in the way they imagined. Clara came to him on the first warm evening of April, when the meadows were beginning to green and the air smelled of possibility. She stood in the doorway of his study, her hands clasped before her, her gray eyes steady. She told him that she needed to leave. She had imposed on his generosity long enough. She had healed enough to walk again, to work, to make her own way in the world. She owed him a debt she could never repay, but she could at least stop adding to it. Caleb set down his book and looked at her for a long moment. Then he asked her a question he had never asked anyone before. He asked her to stay, not as a guest, not as a servant, not as an obligation. He asked her to stay as his wife, as his partner, as the woman who had somehow found the frozen place inside him and taught it to thaw without ever trying to do so. Clara's eyes filled with tears, the first he had seen her shed since her arrival. She told him that she had nothing to offer, no dowry, no family connections, no youth or beauty or prospects. She came to him empty-handed and broken, carrying nothing but grief and memories of people he had never known. She could give him no advantage, no benefit, no return on investment. She was quite possibly the worst choice a man of his position could make. Caleb crossed the room and took her hands in his, feeling the calluses and scars that mapped her journey of loss and survival. He told her that she was wrong. She was the only person in 20 years who had wanted nothing from him, and that made her the only person he had ever trusted. She had come to him with empty hands, And empty hands were exactly what he needed. Not hands reaching for his money, his land, his status, just hands that might perhaps reach for him. They married in June, a small ceremony with only Ruth and a few ranch hands as witnesses. Clara wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton, and Caleb thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The townspeople talked, of course. They speculated about her past, her motives, her mysterious hold on the man who had rejected every eligible woman in the county. Some called her clever, a schemer who had played the long game and won the greatest prize. Others dismissed her as a charity case, a broken creature Thornton had taken in out of pity. None of them understood. On their wedding night, Clara told him about her children. Their names, their faces, their favorite foods, the sounds of their laughter, the way they had reached for her in their final moments. She spoke for hours, and Caleb listened to every word, and in the listening, he allowed her to reclaim a part of herself that she had thought lost forever. She had been more than a widow, more than a wanderer, more than a broken woman who wanted nothing. She had been a mother, fierce and loving, and those children had been real, and their lives had mattered. And now someone else in the world knew their names. They lived together for 23 years, building a life neither of them had imagined possible. Clara never forgot her first family, and Caleb never forgot Mary Ellen. And somehow those old loves did not diminish what they built together but enriched it. They understood that hearts could hold multiple truths, that grief and joy could coexist, that being broken did not mean being finished. On the day Caleb died, surrounded by the grandchildren Clara had helped raise from the orphanage they had opened in her children's memory, he told her that she had been wrong all those years ago. She had come to him with empty hands, but those hands had held everything he ever needed.